A 3-year-old girl vanishes from a holiday apartment. The world was told one story. She was abducted by a stranger who slipped through an open window. But what if that story was never true? What if the abduction was a script, a narrative crafted to conceal a far darker truth of what really happened inside that apartment, days earlier? In this story, we won't chase the phantoms you've seen. We will follow the evidence that was buried. The last photo that doesn't match the timeline. The cadaver dogs whose alerts were ignored. And the powerful forces that silenced the only police officer who got too close. This is not the story of an abduction. This is the story of how that narrative was built. If you are ready to question the official story, like this video and subscribe to our channel. It's time to unravel the truth you were never supposed to know. It was Thursday, the 3rd of May, in the year 2007. The evening was mild, unremarkable. At the tapas restaurant, the sounds were familiar. The low murmur of conversation, the gentle touch of cutlery on plates. 7 friends, adults on holiday, were seated together for their evening meal. They were relaxed, sharing stories, comfortable in the routine they had established over the last few days. This routine included a system. It was a simple, informal agreement, born of a shared situation. Their young children were asleep in ground-floor apartments nearby. The distance was short, negligible really, just seconds away. Close enough, they had reasoned, to check on the children themselves. And so, they did. At intervals, one of the adults would push back their chair, leave the warmth of the restaurant, and take the short walk to peer in on the sleeping children. A quick look, a quiet all clear, and a return to the table. It was a rhythm. It had worked perfectly on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday. It was a system built on trust and proximity. At approximately 9 o'clock, it was Kate McCann's turn. She left the table, moving from the soft light of the dining area out into the quiet of the complex. The walk was familiar, taking only moments. She arrived at the door to apartment 5A. She entered, expecting the same silence she had found on every previous check. She expected to see her 3 children sleeping soundly. The apartment was still. She moved toward the children's bedroom. At first, there was just confusion, a simple, cold registering of facts that did not align. Her 2 youngest children, the twins, were asleep in their cots, but the 3rd bed, Madeleine's bed, was empty. The initial thought was not panic. It was a question. Had she woken up? Had she wandered into the main room? Had she climbed into her parents' bed? Kate checked their bedroom. It was also empty. This was the moment the confusion began to sharpen, to curdle into something else. A cold wave of dread, sudden and sickening. This was wrong. This was not a child wandering. She rushed back to the children's room, her eyes scanning the darkness, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And that is when she saw it. The bedroom window, which she remembered being closed, was open. The shutter outside was raised. The curtain, she would later recall, was moving. This single detail changed everything. The dread crystallized. The narrative in her mind shifted instantly from lost to taken. This was not a child who had wandered off. This was an absence. This was an intrusion. She did not stay. She did not search further. She turned and ran. The short walk back to the restaurant was now a frantic sprint, fueled by a terror that was absolute. She burst back into the dining area, past the other holidaymakers, her face a mask of disbelief. The conversation at the table stopped. 7 faces turned toward her. Forks were frozen halfway to mouths. The comfortable evening rhythm was shattered. She did not say, "She's gone." She did not say, "I can't find her." She screamed words that would echo across the world, words that set the narrative in stone from that very first second. A conclusion, not a question. "They've taken her." Chaos erupted. Chairs were thrown back. Her friends leaped to their feet. The search began, frantic and desperate, in the dark. But the story had already been written in that single, terrified cry. It was not a case of a missing child. It was, from that first moment, a case of abduction. The night was no longer calm. It had been torn open, and it would never be the same. The local police arrived quickly, their presence cutting through the civilian panic. They were professionals, trained to observe, to document, to find the facts that underpinned the fear. They were led into apartment 5A and given the story, the one that was already solidifying, the one that had been born in that first terrible cry, abduction. Their training directed them immediately to the point of entry. In any such case, this is the first chapter of the story. A predator had entered, and a predator had left. The evidence of this passage would be written on the apartment itself. They were shown the children's bedroom, and they were shown the window. This window was now the centerpiece of the entire event. It was the portal through which the unthinkable had happened. Kate McCann had described it as open, the curtain moving in the breeze. This was the image of the violation. The investigators began their work, their approach methodical, quiet, and cold. They looked at the curtain. For it to blow as described, the exterior shutter would have had to be raised. They examined the shutter. It was a rolling, slatted blind, a common feature in the resort. From the outside, forcing such a shutter up from its closed position would require significant effort. It would mean leverage. It would mean noise. It would, almost certainly, leave marks, dents in the metal, scratches in the paint. There were no such marks. It could, they noted, be raised easily from the inside. Then they turned to the window itself. This was the true barrier. They examined the frame, the glass, the locking mechanism. This is where the story of a forced entry would be told. They looked for the telltale signs, the splintered wood of a pry bar, the deep scratches of a tool forced into a gap, the shattered or stressed plastic of a broken latch. There was nothing. The paint on the window frame was smooth and unbroken. The latch was intact, functional. There were no gouges, no chips, no signs of pressure or force. From a forensic standpoint, the window had not been violated. It had, it seemed, simply been opened. The investigators documented this absence. An absence that felt heavy, a silence where there should have been the noise of a break-in. They dusted the window for fingerprints. An intruder, in a hurry, perhaps gloved, might still leave a trace, a smudge, a partial print on the glass or the frame. They found a print. It was clear. It was isolated. They identified it. The single fingerprint found on the casement of the supposed entry and exit point did not belong to an unknown predator. It belonged to Kate McCann. Their methodical search then moved to the area directly outside. If a person had climbed in, and more difficult, climbed out while carrying the weight of a sleeping child, the ground below would be a ledger of that movement. Beneath the window was a flower bed. The soil was soft, forgiving. It was a surface that would have dutifully recorded the event. A clumsy footfall, the drag of a shoe, the deeper impression of a person landing with a child's weight in their arms. The earth would have held that shape. The investigators examined the flower bed with care. The soil was undisturbed. There were no footprints. There were no scuffs or drag marks. The stems of the low-growing plants were unbroken. It was as if no one had ever passed that way at all. Inside the apartment, the story was one of dramatic, violent intrusion. A predator slipping through a window, a curtain blowing like a flag in the night. But outside the apartment, and on the window itself, the physical evidence told a different story. It spoke of stillness. It spoke of an absence of force, an absence of entry, an absence of any stranger at all. The two stories did not align. The officers, standing in the quiet of the bedroom, could feel the dissonance. The narrative they had been given was loud and terrifying. The evidence they were collecting was quiet, contradictory, and deeply unsettling. The scene did not feel like the aftermath of a desperate struggle. It felt, to the trained eye, almost like a carefully arranged set. In the days that followed the disappearance, the world was desperate for a face. A tragedy without a face is an abstraction, but a child's smile makes it real. The media and the public, now fully gripped by the story, needed to see the little girl they were being asked to find. Soon, the photograph was released. It was everything a family snapshot should be. A small girl, bright-eyed, sitting by a swimming pool. She wore a pink sun hat and a smile. Beside her sat her father and her younger sister. It was the picture of a happy, normal holiday. It was innocent, bright, and utterly heartbreaking. But this was not just any photograph. It was presented to the world with a specific, critical piece of information. This was, the world was told, the last known photograph of Madeleine McCann. It came with a precise timestamp. It had been taken, the family said, at 2:29 in the afternoon on Thursday, the 3rd of May. That timestamp became the single most important anchor in the entire case. It was the proof of life. It was the fact that established the timeline for the whole world. It confirmed that Madeleine was alive, safe, and happy at the resort just hours before the alarm was raised. It narrowed the window for the alleged abductor to a small, precise slice of that same evening. The media, the police, the public, everyone accepted this fact. The entire investigation and the world's understanding of the crime was built upon it. But for those who looked closer, for the analysts trained to deconstruct images, the photograph was not as simple as it appeared. Small, unsettling questions began to emerge. The first question was one of light. The shadows in the picture were short, falling almost directly beneath the people in it. This suggested a sun that was high overhead, blazing down from its zenith. This was the light of midday. It did not seem to be the light of almost 2:30 in the afternoon, when the sun would have already begun its descent, casting longer, more angled shadows. It was a subtle discrepancy. The weather was not. The photograph showed a day of brilliant, uninterrupted sunshine. The sky was a deep, clear, cloudless blue. It was the perfect picture of a hot holiday afternoon. The meteorological records for Praia da Luz on Thursday, the 3rd of May, told a very different story. The official reports for that day described it as largely overcast. It was a day of significant cloud cover, not blue skies. It was also, according to the records, notably windy. The weather in the photograph did not belong to the day it was supposed to represent. This led investigators to the final, and most critical, question. In the digital age, a photograph carries its own birth certificate. It is called metadata. Hidden within the file itself is a precise, unchangeable record of the exact moment the picture was taken, the settings of the camera, the type of device used. It is a digital fingerprint, an electronic witness. When the original file of this last photograph was examined to verify the 2:29 timestamp, to settle the questions of the light and the weather, the investigators found nothing. The metadata was gone. It had been wiped, stripped clean from the file. This was not something that happened by accident. It was a conscious, deliberate act. The digital fingerprint that would have proven the photo's time and date had been purposefully erased. The photograph that was meant to be the cornerstone of the entire official story, the one solid fact upon which the timeline of the abduction rested, was suddenly adrift. The light was wrong. The weather was wrong. And its digital proof of existence had been intentionally destroyed. The last photograph was no longer a fact. It was an enigma. The anchor was gone. Without its timestamp, the last photograph was no longer a fixed point in time, but a floating, troubling question. If the clear skies and high sun did not belong to the cloudy afternoon of Thursday, the 3rd of May, then where did they belong? Investigators and analysts began to look backward, comparing the image to the known facts of the family's holiday. They checked the weather records for each preceding day. Wednesday, the 2nd of May, was also described as overcast. Tuesday, the 1st of May, was mixed. But Sunday, the 29th of April, was different. The records for that day showed a perfect, cloudless sky. Bright, sharp, uninterrupted sunshine. It was the first full day of their holiday, and according to statements, it was the day the family had spent time together by that very pool. The weather in the photograph was a perfect match for Sunday, the 29th of April. The implication of this was staggering. If the last verifiable photograph of Madeleine was not from May 3rd, but from April 29th, the entire official story fractured. The accepted timeline, which had compressed the event into a few short hours on a Thursday evening, evaporated. In its place, a new, dark shape emerged, a void. It was a gap of 4 full days. From the end of that sunny Sunday until the moment of the alarm on Thursday night, there was suddenly nothing. No verifiable, independent sightings. No other photographs released to the public from that period. No digital trail. Just a silent, undocumented stretch of time. The world had been focused on the minutes and hours of May 3rd, but the real mystery might lie in the days everyone had ignored. Into this new 4-day void, one piece of testimony, previously overlooked, suddenly became critical. Her name was Pamela Fenn. She was an elderly woman, a resident in the apartment directly above apartment 5A. She had been at home on the night of Tuesday, the 1st of May. This was a night squarely inside that new, undocumented gap. That night, she heard something. It was the sound of a child. And it was not a brief cry, not the simple fussing of a child stirring in their sleep. It was, she would later state, persistent and distressed. It went on and on. She noted the time. The crying was relentless, lasting for well over an hour, continuing until almost 11 o'clock at night. It was the sound of a child in deep anguish, a child that was, it seemed, completely alone. This was the only independent record of Madeleine, or any child, in that apartment during the void. It was not a sighting, it was not a photograph, it was a sound of profound distress. The timeline had been irrevocably altered. The last known verified image was a happy child in the sun on April 29th. The last known independent record was the sound of a child crying in desperate, prolonged anguish on May 1st. After that, the void resumed. A full day passed on Wednesday, the 2nd of May, in total silence. And then came Thursday, the 3rd of May, the day of the alleged abduction. The day that, until now, everyone had believed was the beginning of the story. It was now clear it might have been the end of one. The forensic examination of apartment 5A had yielded nothing. The physical evidence refused to support the story of a violent abduction. The window was untouched. The ground outside was sterile. The only fingerprint found belonged to the mother herself. The investigation, built entirely on the story of an intruder, had run into a wall of silence. The Portuguese police, faced with a case that made no logical sense, decided to bring in a different kind of evidence. They requested specialized resources from the United Kingdom. The resource that arrived was a quiet man named Martin Ney, and he did not come alone. He brought with him 2 partners, a Springer Spaniel named Eddie and another named Keela. These were not pets. They were highly specialized, biological instruments. Eddie was a human remains detection dog, often called a cadaver dog. He was trained to detect the specific, complex scent of human decomposition, a scent he could find in microscopic traces long after the source was gone. Keela was a human blood detection dog. Her specialty was finding the scent of human blood, even if it had been meticulously cleaned or was present in amounts invisible to the human eye. Their track records were flawless. They had worked on hundreds of previous cases, from accidents to homicides. Their alerts were considered gold standard evidence, often forming the entire basis for a successful investigation. They were, in essence, silent witnesses that could not be lied to. Martin Ney brought the dogs to the apartment. The space was now quiet, the initial chaos long gone. He brought Eddie in first. The dog began to work, moving with a focused, systematic energy. His nose tested the air, the floor, the furniture. The handler watched, allowing the dog to follow the scent. Eddie moved through the main living area. He passed the kitchen. He passed the hallway. Then, his behavior changed. He became excited, his breathing quickening. He was drawn, with unerring certainty, not to the front door, and not to the children's bedroom window. He was drawn to the corner of the living room, to the wall space behind the sofa. He stopped. He began to bark. It was not a random noise. It was the specific, trained bark he had been taught to use only when he found his target. He was alerting. He was signaling the undeniable presence of the scent of human death. The handler pulled him back, calmed him, and removed him from the apartment. Then, He brought Keela in. She worked independently. She did not know where Eddie had alerted. She began her own search. Her path was different, but her destination was the same. She too was drawn to the exact same spot behind the sofa. And she too alerted. She was signaling the presence of human blood. The handler was not finished. He took Eddie back inside. He guided him to the master bedroom, the room where the parents had slept. He let the dog work the room. Eddie moved with purpose, sniffing along the base of the walls. He went to the wardrobe. He stopped, and he alerted again. The bark was sharp, confident. Here, too, in the parents' wardrobe, he had found the scent. The implications were immediate and chilling. The dogs had been brought in to find the trail of a kidnapper, to perhaps find a scent leading out of the apartment. Instead, they had found the scent of death inside it, and they had found it in two separate locations. The silent witnesses had spoken. The alerts inside apartment 5A were a chilling, seismic shift in the investigation. The scent of death and blood, found in the very places the family lived and slept, painted a picture that was impossible to reconcile with the story of an outside intruder. But the work of the silent witnesses was not yet finished. The handler's attention now turned away from the holiday apartment and toward the family's movements after the night of the alarm. The family had, almost a month after reporting Madeleine missing, hired a new vehicle. It was a silver Renault Scenic. This car had no connection to the apartment. It had no place in the official story of the abduction. It was simply a mode of transport, rented 25 days after the child had vanished. Martin Ney decided to deploy the dogs to this vehicle. It was a logical step in a normal investigation, but here, it was a test of an impossible theory. He began not with the car, but with the key. He presented the key fob for the Renault Scenic to Eddie, the human remains detection dog. The dog sniffed the small piece of plastic, and he alerted. The scent was on the key. Grime then took both dogs to the underground parking garage where the car was located. He brought Eddie to the vehicle first. The dog was methodical. He circled the car, his nose working the seams of the doors, the wheel wells, the windows. He showed interest, but it was not until he reached the rear of the vehicle that his behavior changed dramatically. He was drawn to the boot, the luggage compartment. He became frantic, scratching at the carpet, his breathing sharp, desperate to get to the source of the scent. He gave his trained bark. It was the strongest, loudest alert he had given yet. There was no ambiguity. Eddie was signaling that the scent of human remains was, or had been, inside the boot of this car. Eddie was removed. After a period to allow the air to settle, Keela, the blood detection dog, was brought in. She worked the same path, unaware of where Eddie had alerted. She too circled the car, and she too was drawn inexorably to the boot. She began to bark, signaling the presence of human blood in the same location. The timeline was shattered. This was not a car that existed on the night of the disappearance. It was a car rented 25 days later. For the scent of death and blood to be in that boot, the source of that scent must have been placed there, long after the world was told Madeleine had been stolen by a stranger. It suggested an event of concealment. It suggested the movement of remains. This evidence was beyond explosive. It was definitive. Samples of hair and fiber were meticulously collected from the boot, from the very spot where both dogs had alerted. These samples were sealed and sent to the United Kingdom's foremost forensic laboratory, the Forensic Science Service. The expectation was that these samples would provide the final, irrefutable DNA match. The entire case balanced on a knife edge, waiting for the results. The report finally came back. It was authored by a senior scientist, Dr. John Lowe. But it was not the confirmation investigators expected. It was not a denial, either. The report used a single, devastatingly neutral word. The findings, it said, were inconclusive. The scientists stated that the DNA sample was too complex to provide a meaningful interpretation. There were components that leaned toward the missing child, but not enough to be called a definitive match. With that one word, the most damning physical evidence yet discovered was officially neutralized. The dog's alerts, which pointed to an impossible and horrifying sequence of events, were sidelined. The inconclusive report from the highly respected laboratory gave the official narrative just enough room to survive. The scent in the machine, and the impossible question it raised, was buried under a file of complex, ambiguous science. The investigation had now fractured into two distinct realities. In one, there was the physical evidence, the sterile window, the silent ground, and the impossible, damning alerts from the dogs. In the other, there was the human evidence, the story told by the parents. But the parents were not alone. They were surrounded. The group they dined with that night, the friends who shared the tapas and the wine, were not just peripheral figures. They were the foundation of the entire official story. They were the ones who built the timeline. They were the witnesses to the checking system. Their testimony was crucial. It was the only thing that confirmed the parents' movements. It was the only thing that established the narrow window of opportunity for a supposed abductor. When the Portuguese investigators began taking their statements, they expected the normal chaos of memory, especially memory forged in a moment of panic. They expected contradictions, inconsistencies, and disagreements over timing. Human recollection, particularly in a group, is never uniform. One person remembers the sky as dark, another as dusk. One person remembers a check at 9:15, another at past. But that is not what they found. As the statements were gathered, a strange and unsettling pattern emerged. The accounts of the friends were not chaotic. They were synchronized. They were aligned with an eerie, almost mechanical precision. They all described the checking system. They all supported the timeline. One friend's check, according to their statements, would end just as another's began. They formed a tight, interlocking alibi. The details matched. The observations were uniform. The narrative was singular. It was, investigators felt, too perfect. It felt less like a collection of individual memories and more like a finalized, rehearsed script. When investigators pushed on this perfect wall, they found cracks. The timeline the friends provided, while internally consistent, began to buckle under logical scrutiny. If their accounts of the checks were mapped out, it revealed vast, unattended gaps of time where no one had looked at the children. Then, in other moments, the timeline was impossibly crowded, with multiple checks supposedly happening in a sequence that made no logical sense. The checking system, as described, was a paradox. It was somehow both constant enough to provide a perfect alibi, yet porous enough to allow an abductor to slip in undetected. It seemed designed not to reflect reality, as messy as it might be, but to create a specific narrative. This led the Portuguese investigators to a dark and profound suspicion. They began to question if they were dealing with individual witnesses at all, or with a single, unified front. They began to suspect a pact of silence. These were not just casual holiday acquaintances. They were a tight-knit group of professionals. Their careers, their reputations, and their own judgments as parents were all on the line. If the official story of diligent checking collapsed, it would not only implicate the parents, it would implicate every adult at that table for leaving multiple children alone and unattended. Self-preservation, investigators theorized, had become paramount. Loyalty had overtaken objective truth. This wall of silence proved to be impenetrable. In the weeks, the months, and the long, agonizing years that followed, not one of the friends dining at that table ever broke rank. Not one of them ever publicly questioned the timeline. Not one ever offered a memory that contradicted the official, unified script. Their testimony, given in the first confusing hours, remained frozen in time, identical years later, defying the natural erosion and fragmentation of human memory. This silence was not passive. It was an active, deliberate choice. The circle of friends had become more than just witnesses to a tragedy. They had become the guardians of the narrative. Their collective, unwavering voices and their profound, shared silence ensured that whatever really happened at that table and in those apartments remained locked away from the world. The physical investigation had stalled, blocked by inconclusive reports and a timeline that seemed designed to be unbreakable. The Portuguese investigators, frustrated by the lack of physical clues, turned their focus to the other type of evidence: the words. In a crisis, language becomes pure. Fear, grief, and innocence have a distinct sound. So too does deception. Deception is not just about telling a lie. It is about the complex architecture of the language used to support it. Statement analysis, the forensic examination of words, looks for these cracks. The very first words spoken that night were, "They've taken her." This phrase, cried out in the night, became the title of the entire, unfolding story. But to an analyst, the words were strange. They were not the words of discovery. A parent finding an empty bed would be expected to cry out in confusion, "She's gone," or "I can't find her," or simply her name, screamed into the night. The words, "They've taken her," were different. It was not a question. It was a conclusion. It was a statement of prescriptive knowledge. In the very first instant of supposed discovery, a narrative was presented, fully formed. A kidnapping, perpetrated by an unknown, plural entity, they. It was a statement that told the world what had happened, before a single investigator had even arrived. As the days turned into weeks, the language used by the parents was placed under a microscope. A pattern emerged. Innocence, analysts note, is simple. It uses direct, categorical denial. When asked a direct question, an innocent person will say, "I did not do this." The parents' language, however, consistently relied not on denial, but on persuasion. When confronted with suspicion, their responses were not, "We did not harm her." Their responses were, "We would never harm our children." This is a subtle, but profound, linguistic shift. One is a denial of an act. The other is an argument about character. They were attempting to convince the world of their nature as loving parents, while meticulously avoiding a simple, declarative denial of the specific event. The more the parents spoke, the more these verbal red flags appeared. The most jarring example came when the evidence of the dogs, Eddie and Keela, was presented. The alerts for the scent of death and blood, both in the apartment and in the rental car, were the single most devastating pieces of physical evidence in the case. This evidence was inconvenient, illogical, and pointed toward an unthinkable scenario. When a journalist later confronted Jerry McCann with this evidence, with the fact that the dogs had alerted, his response was not horror or confusion or a desperate plea to understand why. His response was mockery. "Ask the dogs," he said. It was a statement of pure, sarcastic deflection. It was an attempt to ridicule the evidence itself, to make the gold standard witnesses seem absurd. It was not the language of a man desperate for answers. It was the language of a man trying to make the question itself illegitimate. The Portuguese investigators were listening. They, too, had noticed the deflections, the persuasion, the synchronized statements of the friends, and the timeline that did not make sense. They compiled a list of questions. These were not vague inquiries. They were specific, direct, and targeted. The deep inconsistencies in the official narrative. There were questions about the checks, about the timeline, about the contradictions between their statements and the statements of their friends. The list grew to 48 questions. This list was formally presented to Kate McCann. She was now an arguida, an official person of interest. This was her opportunity to clarify the timeline, to resolve the contradictions, to provide the investigators with the details they needed. An innocent parent, desperate to find their child, would presumably seize the chance to answer anything, to clear up any confusion, to help in any way possible. Kate McCann, on the advice of her lawyers, chose to respond with silence. She refused to answer. Not one. Not a single one of the 48 questions was given a reply. This was the ultimate linguistic act. Where persuasion and deflection had failed, a wall of total silence was erected. The language, which had been so carefully curated to build the abduction narrative, now ceased to exist. That silence, in the face of 48 specific, factual questions, was, to the investigators, the loudest confession of all. The abduction narrative, proclaimed in the first panicked moments of that night, had a fundamental, structural weakness. It had a victim, and it had a scene at the open window, but it was missing the most critical component. It had no abductor. There was no physical evidence of a stranger. No foreign DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers, no footprints in the soft earth. The story was a vacuum. And into that vacuum, a phantom had to be conjured. The official narrative, in order to survive, needed a body. It needed a shadow to chase. That shadow was provided not by forensics, but by testimony. Jane Tanner, one of the friends from the tapas dinner, one of the members of the now unified Wall of Silence, provided the first and most critical piece. She told investigators that at approximately 9:15 in the evening, as she walked up the hill past the McCann's apartment, she saw something. She described a man walking quickly, almost briskly, away from the resort. He was, she said, carrying a small child. The child was in pajamas, she noted, with bare feet. This image, this Tanner man, became the single most important element of the abduction story. This was it. This was the proof. This single, fleeting observation became the scaffolding upon which the entire abduction theory was built. It was the linchpin, the one piece of human testimony that gave the they from Kate McCann's initial cry a face, a direction of travel, and a physical form. The media seized upon it. Here was the kidnapper, caught in the act, escaping into the night. But this phantom, too, had a fatal flaw. Jane Tanner was not the only person on that street at 9:15. At the very moment she claimed to have seen this man, Jerry McCann himself was standing just meters away, at the top of the street. He was not alone. He was engaged in a conversation with another holidaymaker, Jeremy Wilkins. When investigators spoke to Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins, their testimony created an impossible contradiction. They both confirmed they saw Jane Tanner walk past them. They registered her presence. But they did not see the man. They did not see the child. This was not a minor discrepancy. It was a complete structural fracture in the heart of the official timeline. The investigation was presented with two mutually exclusive realities. In one, Jane Tanner sees an abductor carrying a child, walking directly past the child's father. In the other, the child's father and another witness, standing in the same line of sight, see Jane Tanner, but see no abductor and no child. Both realities could not be true. Logically, the testimony of two men, one of whom was the child's father, should have immediately invalidated the Tanner man's sighting. The sighting was uncorroborated and, in fact, directly contradicted by multiple other witnesses. Yet, the narrative machine made its choice. The testimony of Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins was minimized, while the Tanner man sighting was elevated. It was broadcast to the world. It became the face of the crime. The phantom was given life, precisely because the abduction story could not survive without it. But the parade was not over. Another phantom was about to appear. Later that same night, at approximately 10 o'clock, an independent Irish family, the Smiths, were walking through the streets of Praia da Luz. They too saw a man. He was carrying a small, sleeping child. At first, this seemed to be the breakthrough the abduction narrative desperately needed. Here was corroboration. An independent family, with no connection to the tapas group, had seen a man carrying a child. It seemed to confirm the Tanner man's sighting. But this phantom held a secret. It was not a carbon copy of the Tanner man. It was something far more dangerous to the official story. The witness, Martin Smith, gave a description of the man. He described his awkward gait. He described the way he carried the child. And then he delivered the detail that should have stopped the entire investigation and redirected it. The man he saw, the man carrying a child through the streets of Praia da Luz on the night of the disappearance, looked, he said, like Jerry McCann. This was not corroboration. It was a time bomb. This sighting, from a credible, independent witness, did not point to a stranger. It did not support the Tanner man phantom. It pointed in the one direction the entire narrative machine was designed to avoid. The story pointed not outward, into the dark streets of the resort, but inward, back toward the dinner table, back toward the family at the very center of the storm. The reaction was immediate and telling. The Tanner Man sighting, despite its impossible contradictions, was championed. The Smith Man sighting, with its devastating implications, was quietly buried, dismissed as an irrelevance, and kept from the headlines. The Parade of Phantoms was, in fact, a carefully managed piece of theater, designed to ensure the audience was always looking in the right direction, away from the stage. The phantom of Tanner Man lingered. For years, it remained the single pillar supporting the entire official abduction theory. It was the only evidence that a stranger had been present, the only observation that gave life to the they who had supposedly taken the child. But it was a pillar cracked down the middle. As the years stretched on, the central contradiction of that sighting did not fade. It festered. It became a point of logical poison for the official narrative. How could one woman see an abductor, yet two men, including the child's own father, standing just meters away, see nothing? It was an impossibility. It was a paradox that could not be solved. One side was lying, or catastrophically mistaken. If Jane Tanner was mistaken, the entire abduction theory collapsed. There was no kidnapper. If Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins were lying, the implications were just as dark. For a long time, the narrative machine chose to simply ignore this paradox. It was the inconvenient truth swept under the rug. The Tanner Man sighting was endlessly repeated in the media as fact, while the devastating contradiction from the child's father was treated as a confusing, minor detail. But as pressure mounted, as independent researchers and critics focused on this central gaping hole in the story, the paradox became too large to ignore. It was a wound that would not close. The official story was bleeding credibility. The narrative needed a new solution. It needed a fix. Then, 6 long years after the child's disappearance, a new investigation, a British-led operation with a budget of millions, announced a stunning breakthrough. They had solved the Tanner Man sighting. They announced, with great confidence, that Tanner Man was real. Jane Tanner had seen a man carrying a child. But he was not an abductor. He was, they claimed, an innocent British tourist, a father, just like Jerry McCann. This man, they explained, had been at the resort that night. He had gone to the very same Ocean Club creche to pick up his own child, a child of a similar age. He had then walked back to his apartment, passing the tapas restaurant, at almost the exact same time around 9:15 that Jane Tanner was walking by. This new figure, identified and named, became known to researchers as Crashman. This story was, on its surface, a masterstroke of narrative repair. It was a fix so perfect, so neat, it seemed to solve every problem at once. It validated Jane Tanner. She was no longer a fantasist or a liar. She had seen what she claimed to see. It explained her mistake. She had simply, in the poor light, mistaken an innocent father for a sinister figure. And, most critically, it explained why Jerry McCann and Jeremy Wilkins saw nothing of importance. They, too, would have seen this innocent father pass by. But why would they remember it? He was just another tourist, another dad, in a resort full of them. He was unremarkable. He was background noise. The paradox was, in a single press release, supposedly solved. The Tanner Man sighting was no longer a contradiction. It was just a simple, tragic mistake. The abduction, the authorities insisted, was still real. It just had not been witnessed by Jane Tanner. But this solution, this fixer, was, to many, more suspicious than the original problem. The questions were immediate and profound. Why did it take 6 years to find this man? He was not a phantom. He was a registered guest at the resort. He had used the creche, a facility with sign-in sheets and records. His name and his family's presence were documented. In fact, the story became even more complex when it was revealed that the man's own wife, having heard the Tanner Man description in the first days of the investigation, had reportedly tried to contact authorities. She believed her husband might be the man they were looking for, and she wanted to clarify that he was innocent. She had, it was claimed, been ignored. For 6 years, This simple, exculpatory information, which would have instantly neutralized the Tannerman sighting, was apparently disregarded. Now, only when the official narrative was under severe strain was this innocent tourist produced, like a rabbit from a hat. He was not a discovery. He was a retroactive fix. He was a piece of narrative scaffolding, brought in long after the fact to patch the hole that threatened to bring the whole building down. The Crashman story was not evidence of a thorough investigation. It was evidence of a story in desperate need of an editor. It was narrative maintenance, performed in broad daylight, years after the fact. With this single act, the official story quietly performed a complete reversal. The linchpin of the abduction, the Trowerman sighting, was now officially, by their own admission, an error. The abductor was, once again, a complete phantom, with no sightings, no witnesses, and no evidence. The fix had solved the contradiction, but in doing so, it had accidentally erased the entire basis for the abduction in the first place. The narrative was in critical condition. The Tannerman paradox had been fixed with a solution that, upon inspection, seemed more like a patch than a revelation. The public, once universally sympathetic, was beginning to grow restless. The constant sightings and new leads that led nowhere had begun to fray patience. Most dangerous of all, the Portuguese investigators, led by Gonçalo Amaral, were not following the script. They were ignoring the phantoms. They remained focused, with stubborn, methodical precision, on the apartment, on the alerts from the dogs, on the inconclusive DNA, on the 48 unanswered questions. They were building a case, not for an abduction, but for something far darker, a death, a staged scene, and a concealment. The official story, the one born in the first cry of "they've taken her," was under direct threat, not from strangers, but from the official investigators themselves. The narrative needed more than just a patch. It needed a protector. It needed a professional. Then he arrived. He was not just another lawyer or family friend. He was, in every sense, a man from the ministry. His name was Clarence Mitchell. This was not a man who specialized in celebrity scandals or corporate rebranding. His background was in government. He was, until shortly before his arrival, the head of the media monitoring unit for the British government. He had worked inside the very heart of the state's information machine, under the Prime Minister. His job had been to watch, to analyze, and to shape how the government's message was perceived by the public. He was an expert in the architecture of information, a master of the press, not as a tool for truth, but as an instrument of policy. His arrival signaled a profound shift in the case. This was no longer a family tragedy being reported by the news. It was becoming a media operation, conducted with professional, state-level precision. Mitchell's official title was spokesman, but his role was that of a commander. He immediately took control of the entire flow of information. The wall of silence that had defined the Tapas 7 was now formalized, centralized, and given a single, articulate voice. His strategy was twofold, and devastatingly effective. First, the offensive. The narrative had to shift the blame. The Portuguese police, the only people actively investigating the death in the apartment theory, had to be neutralized. Almost overnight, the tone of the British media, and by extension the global media, began to change. The Portuguese investigators were no longer portrayed as methodical detectives. They were painted as bumbling, incompetent, slow, and lazy. They were accused of contaminating evidence, of losing clues. A subtle but powerful thread of xenophobia was woven in. They were anti-British, jealous, and unprofessional. Gonçalo Amaral, the lead detective, was singled out. He was painted as a man with a vendetta, a cruel and obsessed figure, driven by a personal desire to frame the innocent, grieving parents. His investigation was not a search for truth. It was a witch hunt. Second, the defensive. Mitchell began to feed the media machine what it craved. Stories. But these were not just any stories. They were a curated, constant stream of new leads and suspects, all designed to point away from the apartment. Sources close to the family would suddenly reveal a credible new sighting in another country. An anonymous tip would point to a new person of interest. Complex, Unverified theories about trafficking rings and mysterious figures would be leaked to friendly journalists. The media, starved for updates, eagerly consumed it all. They were no longer investigators, digging into the Tannerman paradox or the dog alerts. They were broadcasters, acting as a megaphone for the carefully crafted narrative. To question the official story was now to side with the incompetent Portuguese police. To ask hard questions was to be cruel and inhumane to a grieving family. Clarence Mitchell had successfully performed a great act of narrative alchemy. He had transformed the parents from persons of interest back into pure victims. He had turned the official investigators into the villains of the story. The media was no longer covering the case. It was participating in it. It had become an echo chamber, amplifying the one, single, approved version of events. The man from the ministry had taken control of the story, and with it, he had ensured that the inconvenient questions, the ones about the dogs, the window, the timeline, and the 48 points of silence were drowned out by the noise of 1,000 phantom leads. The media operation was a resounding success. Clarence Mitchell, the man from the ministry, had effectively commanded the airwaves, repainting the official investigators as villains and the parents as persecuted victims. But this was, in essence, a war of shadows, a battle for public perception. It could influence headlines, but it could not, on its own, stop the relentless, grinding gears of a sovereign police investigation. And that investigation, led by Gonçalo Amaral, was becoming mortally dangerous to the official narrative. Amaral was not reading the British tabloids. He was reading his own files. He was listening to the unquiet echoes in apartment 5A. He had the sworn statements from the dog handlers, men whose work was trusted in countless other cases. He had the inconclusive DNA report from the United Kingdom, a report so complex and caveated that its very ambiguity screamed that something had been found. He had the silence of the Tapas 7, a uniformity of alibi that defied the chaos of genuine human memory. He had the 48 unanswered questions that Kate McCann had refused to address. And he was moving forward. The Portuguese detective was not just a bumbling fool, as the new narrative insisted. He was a methodical senior inspector, and he was building his case, piece by piece. The next logical, legal step was clear. The evidence no longer pointed to a phantom abductor. It pointed, with chilling precision, back inside the apartment. He was preparing, it was understood, to formalize his theory. He was on the verge of declaring that the child had not been taken, but had perished, and that the scene had been staged. This was the ticking clock. A public relations campaign was no longer enough. The narrative machine could not stop a legal filing. To stop a determined, sovereign investigator, one needed a force greater than headlines. One needed power. The intervention, when it came, was not subtle. It was a display of raw, geopolitical dominance. A move so blatant it would be spoken of in hushed tones for years to come. It began, as reports would later claim, with direct contact. Jerry McCann, a British citizen, and a man with a clear understanding of how systems worked, allegedly appealed directly to the highest levels of the British government. He made contact with the office of the new Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. The framing of this appeal was critical. This was not, the story went, a request for interference. It was a plea for help. It was the story of a British family, innocent and grieving, being unjustly persecuted on foreign soil. It was a narrative of xenophobia, of a witch hunt, exactly as Clarence Mitchell had been seeding in the media. It was the perfect pretext for what was to come. A prime minister, especially a new one, cannot be seen to ignore the desperate pleas of his citizens abroad. The optics were perfect. The response was immediate. The full diplomatic weight of the United Kingdom, a major European power, was brought to bear on Portugal, a nation that relied heavily on British tourism. This was no longer a police matter. It had become an issue of statecraft. British diplomats, who had been assisting from the early days, now allegedly changed their tone. High-level calls were made, not just to the police, but to the Portuguese government itself. The message, though veiled in the polite, coded language of diplomacy, was clear. This investigation is becoming a problem. The Portuguese authorities were caught in an impossible vice. On one side, they had their own senior detective, Gonçalo Amaral, who was following a strong, evidence-based line of inquiry. On the other, they had a powerful political and economic ally, an ally that was making it clear, in no uncertain terms, that this line of inquiry was unhelpful, unproductive, and damaging to relations. Gonçalo Amaral himself would later describe it, in his own book, as unprecedented political pressure. He spoke of an intervention so direct that it paralyzed his superiors. This raised the most unsettling question of all. Why? Why would the British government, a nation built on the rule of law, intervene so forcefully to stop a legitimate, ongoing police investigation in another sovereign country? The story of simply protecting a grieving family felt thin. The level of intervention seemed disproportionate, excessive, and strange. This is where the unquiet whispers began. The whispers that this was never just about a family. The whispers that the involvement of high-level government assets, like Clarence Mitchell, was not a coincidence. The whispers that the true connections of the family, or perhaps their friends, reached into sensitive areas of the British establishment. The whispers, which have never been substantiated but have also never gone away, began to include the names of British intelligence services. MI5, MI6. Why were such names even being mentioned in the context of a missing child? What asset, what operation, what interest could possibly be at stake that would require such a heavy-handed, high-level maneuver? The questions hung in the air, deep and dark and unanswered. But the result of the pressure was not ambiguous at all. It was brutally clear. Gonçalo Amaral was removed from the case. The detective who had followed the dogs, who had questioned the timeline, who had dared to challenge the official narrative, was pulled from his own investigation. It was a public and humiliating decapitation. The message to every other officer in the Polícia Judiciária was immediate and chilling. Do not go near this. Do not follow this path. The case is closed. And just like that, it was. The Portuguese police, neutered and politically outmaneuvered, shelved their investigation. The death in the apartment theory was officially buried, not by new evidence, but by a political decree. The Crown's intervention had been a total success. The one man who refused to believe the abduction script had been silenced. The path was now clear. The official narrative, protected by a wall of media. A fantasy is not the same as a simple lie. A lie is an inversion of truth. A fantasy is a complete parallel construction. It is a world built of pure narrative, designed to be so compelling, so emotionally resonant, that it completely obscures the real, physical world it is meant to conceal. It is a magic trick. The entire audience is told to look at the magician's right hand, where a phantom is being conjured, while the left hand, the one holding the devastating, simple, and unmagical truth, is hidden in plain sight. The disappearance of the child in Praia da Luz was not a mystery. It was, from this perspective, a forensic fantasy. It was a story that required the public, the media, and eventually the authorities, to agree to ignore everything that was physically present, and to instead accept everything that was physically absent. To believe the abduction narrative, the official, sanctioned story, one must believe in a series of impossibilities. One must believe in a phantom who could pass through a locked door or a sealed window without leaving a single trace of his passing. One must believe in a criminal who left no fibers, no hair, no foreign DNA, no fingerprints, and no scuff marks on the soft earth. One must believe in an intruder who moved with supernatural silence, unseen by any witness on the street, unheard by any child in the room. One must believe that this specter managed to navigate the resort, carrying a child, while avoiding every single surveillance camera. But most of all, to believe the abduction, one must disbelieve everything else. One must disbelieve the noses of two of the world's most highly trained specialist dogs, Eddie and Keela. One must believe that their gold standard records were irrelevant, and that their persistent, independent alerts for the scent of human death and human blood inside the apartment, and later, inside the rental car, were meaningless. One must choose to believe the phantom over the dogs. One must disbelieve the timeline. One must accept the last photograph as a gospel truth, despite the fact that its own light and shadows contradict its timestamp, despite the fact that its weather contradicts the meteorological reports for that day, and despite the most damning fact of all, that its digital fingerprint, the EXIF data that would have proven its date and time beyond all doubt, had been surgically and professionally removed. This removal was not an accident. In the construction of a fantasy, it was a necessity. The photo had to be stripped of its own truth so it could be assigned a new one. Its new truth was to serve as a temporal anchor, a tool to stretch the illusion of life across a 4-day void, to place the child alive and smiling, just hours before the curtains rose on the play. The forensic fantasy posits that the catastrophe, the central, unthinkable event, was not an event of May 3rd at all. It was an event of April 30th, or perhaps May 1st. It was an event that happened inside those walls, during the 4-day void, punctuated perhaps by the sound of a child crying relentlessly for hours, as a neighbor, Pamela Fenn, had reported. In this chilling reconstruction, the days between that event and the night of May 3rd were not days of leisure. They were days of panic, of desperate planning, of the slow, cold construction of a new reality. If the event happened days earlier, then the night of May 3rd was not a discovery. It was a deployment. It was the moment the fantasy was activated. The theater of the open window was the stage set. The whooshing curtain, the unlocked shutter, these were not clues left by an intruder. They were props, placed to provide a visual, to scream abduction. Kate McCann's first words into the night, "They've taken her," were not a question, not a cry of confusion. They were the title of the play, delivered to the audience. It was the prescriptive knowledge that statement analysts had found so chilling. The wall of silence from the top of 7 was the script. Their perfectly aligned statements, their impossible, overlapping timeline of checks, this was the dialogue, rehearsed and reinforced, designed to build an alibi not for one person, but for an entire evening. It created a fortress of Alloc-like consistency, where no one's story fractured, because they were all reading from the same page. The phantoms were the supporting cast. Tannerman and Smithman were not real suspects. They were narrative devices, shadows thrown onto the wall to keep the audience looking for a monster in the dark. The 6-year fix of Crashman was simply a rewriting of the script, a patch to cover a plot hole that had become too obvious. The media management by the man from the ministry, Clarence Mitchell, was the production. He was the director, ensuring the audience saw only what they were supposed to see, ensuring the incompetent Portuguese police were the villains, and the parents the heroes, and the Crown's intervention was the ultimate producer. When the local director, Gonçalo Amaral, refused to follow the script when he kept filming the stagehands and the props instead of the abductor, he was fired. The state itself had stepped in, not to find the truth, but to protect the fantasy. This is the forensic fantasy, a story so complete, so well-funded, so politically protected, that it became more real than the truth. It was built because the truth, a simple, domestic, and perhaps accidental tragedy, was too mundane, too awful, and too reputationally catastrophic to ever be allowed to see the light of day. The world was given a cinematic blockbuster of a mystery, because the alternative was a short, brutal, and unbearable story of negligence or panic, and the cold, unmagical reality of the unquiet scent that Eddie and Keela had found behind the sofa. The forensic fantasy was a monumental construction. It was a narrative fortress, built of media spin, political leverage, and a wall of unyielding silence. But why? Why build a fortress of such staggering complexity, one that required the complicity of friends, the intervention of governments, and the manipulation of the entire global press? The answer, as always, is found not in the complexity, but in the simplicity of the motive. The why is the most human, and the most devastating element of all. It is about the chasm that exists between an accident and a crime, and the terrible, blinding panic that lives in that space. To believe the fantasy, one must believe in a predator. To believe the alternative, one must confront the unthinkable, a moment of profound, catastrophic negligence, or worse, A simple, awful accident. The stakes were not just about grief. They were about identity. The parents were doctors. They were professionals, individuals whose entire lives were built on a foundation of competence, control, and public trust. Their identities were not just parent, but Dr. McCann. In this light, a story of an abduction, however terrible, is a story of victimhood. It is a passive role, a tragedy that happened to them. It is a story that invites sympathy, support, and international aid. A story of negligence, however, is a story of agency. It is a tragedy that happened because of them. It is a story that invites judgment, scorn, and professional ruin. It is the end of a career. It is the end of a reputation. It is a social and professional annihilation from which there is no recovery. This is the motive. It is the desperate, primal instinct for survival, not physical survival, but reputational survival. The decision to build the fantasy was not a cold, calculated act, at least not at first. It was almost certainly born in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, a moment when a terrible, irreversible event had occurred, a moment when the future, their careers, their other children, their entire lives flashed before their eyes. In that moment, a choice was made. Perhaps it was not even a spoken choice. Perhaps it was a single, small act of concealment, a delay, a moment of what do we do, that stretched from minutes to an hour to a day. That first lie, that first act of concealment, was the point of no return. It was the seed from which the entire, monstrous fantasy had to grow, because a small lie, once told to protect an unbearable truth, must be fed. It must be protected by larger lies, and those by larger ones still, until a fortress is built. But this motive, this why, also created a profound and horrifying logistical problem. If the child had perished days before the abduction was staged, the fortress of narrative had a terrible, physical secret to guard. The child's remains. This is the buried truth. The apartment, 5A, was the stage set. It could not be the final resting place. It was a temporary, desperate holding area. The dogs had confirmed this. Eddie, the cadaver dog, had alerted behind the sofa, a place of concealment, a place of deep, unquiet stillness before the performance of May 3rd began. But the performance had to go on. The police arrived. The media arrived. The apartment was now a crime scene. The temporary solution was now a catastrophic liability. This is where the second and most damning piece of physical evidence enters the story. The silver Renault Scenic, the rental car. The car, on its own, was nothing. It was just a machine, hired weeks after the child had been reported abnormal. It had no logical connection to the events of May 3rd. It should have been sterile. It was not. When Eddie and Keela were brought to that car, they were not just sniffing a vehicle. They were reading the final, missing chapter of the story. Eddie alerted, with undeniable force, to the scent of human death inside the boot, the luggage compartment. Keela alerted to the presence of human blood, a trace so old or small it was invisible to the eye, in the same location. This was the logistical how. It was the solution to the terrible physical problem. The implications of this find are staggering, and they dismantle the entire abduction fantasy. If the scent of death was in that car, it meant the child's remains had been in that car. And since the car was only hired weeks after the disappearance, it meant the concealment had been a protracted, ongoing act. It implies a sequence of events so cold it chills the bone. It implies that after the staged abduction, after the tears, after the television appeals, a second, secret journey was undertaken. It implies that the child's remains were moved from their temporary hiding place, perhaps somewhere in the apartment, perhaps somewhere nearby, and were placed into the boot of this new, clean rental car. This was the act of final concealment, the journey to a more permanent, undiscoverable resting place. And the dogs, in their relentless, biological honesty, offered one final, devastating detail. Eddie did not just alert to the boot. He alerted, with the same intensity, to the key fob, the very object the driver had to hold. It was a physical link, a trace of the scent, transferred from the grim cargo to the hand that held the key, to the key itself. It was the signature of the person who had driven the car, the person who had transported the buried truth. The why was reputation. The why was panic. The why was the unbearable fear of a